Hi, Dennis here, welcome to Time Trip, and today we'll talk about the period after the fall of the Western Zhou Dynasty, when China first looked like this, then like this, and then, for the first time in its history, became a unified empire. We'll also talk about the origins of collective punishment in China and what wandering swordsmen had to do with it. And we'll talk about why one of the most violent periods in Chinese history was at the same time the golden age of Chinese philosophy. The Zhou state we talked about last time was really made up of many small states which were formally governed by the center. Those small states had to pledge loyalty to the center by sending important people who would bring fancy goods as tribute and do rituals, so as to demonstrate that yes, they're loyal and always will be, or at least as long as they have to be. So when the center lost power and collapsed, all those small states became independent. Within each of those many small states you see on the map, there were ruling lineages who now began to struggle for power both within each state and with neighboring states. Not that they had never struggled for power before, but with no center in control, things got more intense. As we'll see, much more intense. What set those ruling lineages apart from the rest of the people was not just that they had a lot of wealth, but also that they did rituals of ancestor worship. It was believed that when a person died, they could come back to Earth as a ghost, seeking revenge for having suffered injustice, unless you were nice to them by sacrificing animals and doing rituals. This also set the aristocrats apart from the rest of the people, because they were the only ones who could do such rituals. Apart from rituals, war was also fought primarily by aristocrats. And when aristocrats would go to war, they would have specific rules of honorable conduct. For example, if a king of an enemy state had died, one was supposed to wait and not take advantage of it to attack, so that they could do the proper mourning. And before a battle, there would be a collective oath in which all warriors would commit themselves to following certain rules of honorable conduct. To begin a battle, armies would not simply attack each other. First of all, the day of battle would be formally set. Then on that day, rituals would be performed by both sides, including ancestor worship. Then the battle itself would be preceded by ritualized provocations, whereby one or several warriors from one army would ride in chariots through the lines of the enemy army and attack some of its members, and then come back to their own army while being pursued by some enemy chariots. So, aristocrats really cared about honor and also about revenge. A personal insult between two aristocrats could easily result in a war between two states. One result of the fragmentation of China had been the emergence of so-called wandering swordsmen, which are a pretty popular topic in kung fu movies. A wandering swordsman was usually an aristocrat who had lost a power struggle at home and had to flee, which was easy because there were many countries next to each other. Or sometimes he was just bored at home and wanted to wander around and have some fun. Kinda like Jack Kerouac, but with a sword. And without cars. Actually, it was nothing like Jack Kerouac. Anyway, he would go to different states and offer his service to local, powerful aristocrats. This meant that he would get some social status and money, and in return he would accept the aristocrat as his master and help him fight other aristocrats. And if something happened to his master, it would be his honorable obligation to avenge him. This idea of moralized, honorable revenge, carried by the wandering swordsman, became really important in all parts of society. Among aristocrats struggling for power, revenge was honorable and even somewhat legal, at least tolerated by the state. It was linked to the idea of ancestor worship, because if your ancestor remained unavenged, he might come back to Earth to haunt people. There was a whole class of people whose main occupation was to engage in vengeance. When somebody went to avenge somebody, those people would join him, sometimes even forming associations of revenge. To understand how this led to the emergence of collective punishment, let's have a look at a quote by Confucius. "One should not bear the same heaven as the murderer of one's father. One should never turn aside one's weapons if one encounters the murder of a brother." As the quote by Confucius illustrates, rules of conduct regarding revenge were guided by family ties and blood relations. So when the punishment was severe, an official had to punish not just one person, but also his family, so as to weaken them and make revenge against him difficult. The state couldn't exclude itself from the cycle of revenge, and collective punishment was the inevitable consequence. But not only swordsmen traveled from country to country. It was one of the intellectually richest periods in Chinese history. Because there was no single state in charge of education and learning, education became very pluralistic, private and independent. If you were a scholar in this period and you didn't agree with your king, you could go to another state. And if you weren't accepted, you could go to the next one, and so on. It was a very chaotic time, and many scholars were wondering what was wrong and had ideas about how a state should be governed. So they went from state to state, hoping to find a ruler who would accept their ideas and give them a position at court. And in the process, they would attract followers and establish different schools of thought. Not only was education more private and pluralistic, it was also more available to common people. For instance, the most famous of those wandering scholars, Confucius, accepted students of different backgrounds and made no class distinctions. There were many other great philosophers during that time, but we can't talk about all of them in this episode, so I'll put some links in the description. So, during the spring and autumn period, there was a lot of war going on. However, since war was fought by aristocrats for aristocrats, armies were small, usually chariot armies of a few thousand people, and they would fight by rules of honor, sometimes completely ignoring pragmatic advantages. An extreme example being Sun Xianggong, who refused to attack an enemy army before it had finished crossing a river. But this slowly began to change. The aristocrats noticed that when they had bigger chariot armies, they could fight better. Makes sense, right? So they began to expand those armies, and in the 5th century, chariot armies could already number up to 50,000 chariots. But it didn't stop there. It turned out that huge armies of mass infantry were even more powerful than those slightly larger chariot armies. This meant that the nature of war and of the state changed fundamentally. While in the spring and autumn period, war meant power struggle between small armies of aristocrats, war in the Warring States period meant total war. War became the most important function of the state. Each state would mobilize as many ordinary people as it could, often hundreds of thousands, and send them into war trying to destroy the other states. These people were not supposed to be brave or courageous any longer. They had to be willless puppets, blindly obedient to do whatever they were told by the commander. War became a large-scale fight between masses of ordinary people, completely controlled by the will of the two superior minds of the commanders. As it is said in The Art of War by Xunzi, the host thus forming a single united body, it is impossible either for the brave to advance alone, or for the cowardly to retreat alone. This is the art of handling large masses of men. This is why this period saw the emergence of military command as a special discipline and art. Talented people were now being specifically selected and trained for the profession of the military commander, and there emerged a whole body of literature on military command, the most famous work being Art of War by Sun Tzu, which I already quoted from and which is still of worldwide importance for military tactics even today. The nature of the state itself also changed fundamentally. With constant all-out war going on, each state found itself in the situation of either having to eat or to be eaten. The most important goal for any state was to survive, and to do so it had to mobilize as many people as it could for war. Now, to draw all these people into war and to make the rest do as much agriculture as possible, every state needed to have tight control over pretty much everybody and everything. Also, while before, power within each state had been divided among many members of the aristocracy, power in the Warring States period became increasingly concentrated in the hands of a single king. It's hard to say why exactly this happened. Maybe because in times of war, this was a more effective form of government. So each state had to adopt some sort of reform aimed at controlling the people and making them do war. But the state that did this much more extremely than the other states was the state of Qin. In the 4th century BC, Minister Shang Yang, who had come to the state of Qin as one of those wandering intellectuals we talked about, successfully pushed an ideology that would later be written down in the book of Lord Shang. Here's a quote: "When the people are weak, the state is strong. When the people are strong, the state is weak. Hence, the state that possesses the way devotes itself to weakening the people." That doesn't sound very nice or democratic, does it? But it gets much worse. Therefore, fathers and elder brothers, minor brothers, acquaintances, relatives by marriage and colleagues all say what we should be devoted to is only war, and that is all. And entering the gates of riches and nobility must be through military service. Therefore, when they hear about war, the people congratulate each other. Whenever they move or rest, drink or eat, they sing and chant only about war. As these quotes illustrate, Shang Yang's focus lay on a strong state capable of war. He organized the whole population into units of several households where people would be mutually responsible for each other. If you reported a crime of another person, you'd be rewarded. If you knew about a crime and you did not report it, you might be cut in half. And those who didn't work enough would become slaves. As a legalist philosopher, Shang Yang also believed that to control people and to make them do war, a state needed harsh punishments, like 吃力, whereby a person would be torn apart by 5 chariots. Collective punishment was also a good thing. Such punishments were to be applied, for example, for treason, of which Shang Yang himself later was accused. So ironically, he himself received 吃力, and his clan was exterminated. If this doesn't sound like a very fun society to live in, it probably wasn't. However, it was these reforms of Shang Yang which made the Qin state stronger than the other states and made it possible for first Emperor Qin Shi Huang to unify China in 221 BC for the first time ever as an empire. We'll talk more about him in the next episode. The period we talked about today was one of the most violent and chaotic in Chinese history, but also one of the most important, because it ultimately led to the unification of China and because the existential horror of that period made intellectuals struggle to understand their place in society and the universe, and to find a way to create a society that would offer them the stability this period was lacking. The result of this struggle were ideas that would shape China over thousands of years of union and disunion to this very day. Throughout this series, we'll talk a lot more about how exactly this happened in each period. So if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe to our channel and consider supporting us on Patreon. As you can imagine, making such videos requires a lot of research and work, and we need your support to be able to do this.